Good evening and welcome to Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7 on this Friday, the 8th of November. I'm Douglas MacKenzie, bringing you stories from Scotland and around the world. To discuss the implications of those stories, I'm glad to be joined once again by William Duguid, writer, blogger, and near fixture in the Perth Yes Hub. Welcome back,
A
William.
fixture. It's great. It's good to be a
Right.
fixture. Yes, in the hub, and nice to be back here.
Thank you. There are worse things to be than a fixture. But, we start the programme tonight, as we always do, with the update from Ukraine on this day 989 since Russia's full-scale invasion of the country. The Biden administration has confirmed that the US will keep surging aid to Ukraine before Donald Trump becomes president in January. That's not going to change. We're going to surge and get that out there to Ukraine. We understand how important it is to make sure they have what they need, said Karine Jean-Pierre, White House spokesperson. The NATO chief, Mark Rutte, said on Thursday that North Korea's involvement in Russia's war against Ukraine posed a direct threat to the US in a first effort to convince Donald Trump to keep backing Kyiv. What we see more and more is that North Korea, Iran, China, and of course Russia are working together against Ukraine, Rutte said. At the same European leaders meeting in Budapest, where Rutte spoke, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said it would be unacceptable for Europe to offer the Kremlin concessions to halt its invasion of Ukraine after Moscow demanded the West enter direct talks on ending the war. The Russian President Vladimir Putin has demanded that Ukraine cede swathes more territory in its east and south as a precondition for peace talks, while Kyiv has repeatedly ruled out giving up land in exchange for peace. Zelensky also dismissed as dangerous and irresponsible the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban's call for a ceasefire on the battlefield. The Institute for the Study of War think tank said on Thursday, freezing the Russian war in Ukraine on anything like the current lines enormously advantages Russia and increases the risks and costs to Ukraine and the West of deterring, let alone defeating, a future Russian attempt to fulfill Putin's arms by force. Leaders of the Budapest meeting emphasized that with Trump becoming US president, Europe must take charge of its own security. Europe together has spent around $125 billion on supporting Ukraine, while the US alone has coughed up more than $90 billion, according to a tracker from the Kiel Institute. Russia carried out a massive drone attack on Kyiv and killed 4 persons in a strike on a hospital in Zaporizhia in the hours after Donald Trump's victory in the US presidential election, write Dan Savant and Luke Harding. Zelensky urged allies to give Ukraine more air defense systems and to lift restrictions on hitting targets inside Russia using long-range Western weapons. Russia said on Thursday its forces had seized control of Kremina Balka, a village that had a pre-war population of fewer than 50 people in the industrial Donetsk region, where Ukrainian defences have been repeatedly pushed back. Ukraine's relationship with the UK has got worse since the Labour government took power in July, officials in Kyiv are reported to have said. The UK Prime Minister is yet to visit Ukraine 4 months after taking office, and a frustrated Kyiv has said that a trip would be worthless unless Keir Starmer committed to replenishing stocks of the sought-after long-range Storm Shadow system. A couple of things there, William. It seems a bit rich for the White House spokesperson to say they will continue surging equipment to Kyiv, given that only 10% of what's been promised in 2024 has got there now in the month before the end of the year. And also in terms of support, not encouraging what they're saying about Keir Starmer and Britain's support.
No, there's a hint of the lukewarm, isn't there? Biden's idea of what a surge is might not be what anybody else's idea of a surge is. And I think it would be very wise for President Zelensky to start trying at least to get into dialogue with Donald Trump, as I believe he is doing quite separately, just to try and gauge what the situation is, because that's the crucial thing. If Trump wants to end the war in a couple of days, as the rhetoric has said, I don't see how that means anything other than ceasing aid and attempting to freeze things as they are now. Just what the Institute of War and Security said would be massively to Russia's advantage, and that won't be acceptable to Zelensky at all. As for Keir Starmer, he can at least say, I think, that the UK has committed to £3 billion of support for Ukraine every year, but Zelensky is looking for specifics. He's looking for the long-range Storm Shadow missiles, greater supply of those, because he's running out, and those, like everything else, have been promised. And Keir Starmer hasn't visited Ukraine, but I think Zelensky has met him about 6 times. I wonder how deeply unimpressed he is. One doesn't see Keir Starmer as a very inspiring figure for a war leader that's fighting for his very existence to be talking to. That may be a presentational issue, but certainly that is something for Zelensky to bear in mind. I can see reasons for a great deal of nervousness on the Ukrainian side right now.
Yes, of course. Well, every person with a typewriter or keyboard has ventured an opinion on what Donald Trump is going to do. I wonder if Donald Trump knows what he's going to do, but we will see in the coming months, I dare say. Moving on now to the Middle East, and at least 43,508 Palestinians have been killed, and 102,684 have been injured in Gaza since October the 7th, 2023, according to a statement from the Gaza Health Ministry. The toll includes 39 deaths in the previous 24 hours. The UN Human Rights Office said today that nearly 70% of the fatalities it had verified in the Gaza war were women and children, and condemned what it called a systematic violation of the fundamental principles of international humanitarian law. The UN count covers the first 7 months of the Israel-Hamas conflict in the Gaza Strip that began more than a year ago. Police in Amsterdam have said 5 people had been taken to hospital and 62 arrests had been made as a result of clashes that erupted in the Dutch capital overnight after a Europa League football match between home team Ajax and Maccabi Tel Aviv. The clashes had begun on Wednesday, 24 hours before the match. Amsterdam Police Chief Peter Holle said there had been, quote, incidents on both sides on Wednesday night. He added, Maccabi supporters removed a flag from a facade on the Rokin and they destroyed a taxi. A Palestinian flag was set on fire on the dam. Video on social media appeared to show some Maccabi Tel Aviv fans chanting in Hebrew, finish the Arabs, we're going to win. Another video on social media showed crowds running through the streets and a man being beaten, reported Reuters. Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said on Friday that he hoped the US President-elect Donald Trump will tell Israel to stop its war efforts, suggesting a good start would be halting US arms support to Israel. Lebanon state media said today that the Israeli army had detonated explosives planted inside houses in 3 border villages that have been battered by the Israel-Hezbollah war. An advisor to Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, has warned against launching an instinctive response to Israeli airstrikes on the Islamic Republic last month. Yemen's Houthis targeted Israel's southern Nevatim airbase with a hypersonic ballistic rocket called Palestine II. The group also downed a US MQ-9 Reaper in the airspace of the Yemeni province of Al-Jawf early today, the Houthis military spokesperson Yahya Sarria said. People in Gaza have been pushed beyond breaking point, with families, widows and children enduring almost unparalleled suffering, according to the Secretary General of the Norwegian Refugee Council, Jan Egeland, who visited Gaza this week and found scene after scene of absolute despair, with families torn apart and unable to bury relatives who had died. He said that Israel, with Western-supplied arms, had rendered the densely populated area uninhabitable. Hezbollah said it targeted a naval base near the Israeli city of Haifa with missiles today, the second such attack in less than 24 hours. The group said it targeted the Stella Maris naval base northwest of Haifa with a missile barrage in response to the attacks and massacres committed by the Israeli enemy. Human rights organizations say they are gravely concerned that a young Iranian woman arrested for stripping down to her underwear could be subjected to torture. She was transferred to a psychiatric hospital by the authorities. Well, William, one night we're going to appear on this program and there's going to be some good news from Gaza, but tonight is not that night. Again, I know it's almost impossible to predict what Donald Trump might do, given that this is another problem he's going to solve in a couple of days. But will his intervention, I mean, other than stopping arms supplies, actually make any difference to Netanyahu, do you think?
Nothing thus far has made any difference to Netanyahu. The onslaught on all sides has continued, and the rhetoric has continued. The only thing I think that's likely to cause Netanyahu any worries will be increasing loss of faith by the families of the hostages, who are increasingly seeing that this on all sides military campaign has never actually been about releasing the hostages at all. If it has released the hostages, which it has on occasion, it's tended to be accidental, and that the interests of the hostage families are not, patently not, at the forefront of Netanyahu's thinking. So internal pressure from within Israel by those families may be the thing that does give Netanyahu pause. What Netanyahu then does, of course, may not be particularly more elevated than what he's done up till now, but that's where the pressure's coming from. I think Netanyahu will be just as able to ignore Donald Trump if Trump tries to finish things quickly, as he has Biden throughout, and as he has all the other influences that have been trying to get him to hold back. His continued survival rests on continuing the military effort, and that's in the forefront of his mind at all times.
Yeah, I think so. Interesting point you make about internal pressure from within Israel. It's strange. I don't see in most of the Western media any reports on this, and the only place you see it is in Haaretz, which is pretty much the opposition newspaper in Israel, and they showed large amounts of military personnel the other night complaining after Gallant, the defence minister, was sacked, and large protests in favour of supporting the hostage families. Is this insignificant, or is it simply that the Western media is playing along with Israel while deploring things every now and again?
The Western media has tended not to cover it, but we have seen, I think, on the news channels occasions when there have been very, very large crowds in Tel Aviv, at least, of hostage families and those supporting them, saying you need to do something more than what you're actually doing. And also, there has been reported some of the unrest at Yoav Gallant being dismissed, and it remains to be seen what the fallout from that will be. It's never easy to be sure if what you're seeing on the media is giving you any real guide as to what's going on. Certainly, because discussion in the news programs need to be very circumscribed, and if the proponents of one point of view, let's say the Palestinian point of view, are given too much head, no doubt there is protest from the Israeli side, and the broadcasters in particular are very, very aware of that. So it's difficult really to be definitive. You have to go on the little signs that you see, and I think one can see where the cracks are going to be, and it is from within at the moment. But who knows where this all ends, and Trump is an absolute wild card when it comes to this, as so much else.
Indeed. Thank you, William. To the UK now, and Jonathan Powell, the former Chief of Staff to Tony Blair, has been appointed as Sir Keir Starmer's National Security Advisor in a further sign that leading figures from the new Labour era are returning to the government. The veteran former diplomat who played a significant role in the Northern Ireland peace deal struck in 1998 and served Blair for a decade will be responsible for advising on the UK's approach to the war in Ukraine and the international implications of Donald Trump's presidency. Since leaving office, Powell has been a prominent advocate of negotiating with enemies to bring about peace, writing a book called Talking to Terrorists. Powell led discussions on the status of the Chagos Islands for the UK government in September, but his appointment as National Security Advisor will put him at the heart of Downing Street. While previous National Security Advisors have been senior civil servants, Powell is returning as a special advisor to bring a more political edge to the job. Liz Lloyd, no, not the other Liz Lloyd, the former Deputy Chief of Staff under Blair, is also making a comeback, joining Starmer's team as Director of Policy Delivery and Innovation. Other prominent former Blairites in Starmer's government include Pat McFadden, who is Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, Liz Kendall, the Work and Pension Secretary, Alan Milburn, who is unofficially advising the Department of Health and Social Care, and Jackie Smith, a Skills Minister. Powell is widely considered a Blairite, having been close to the former Prime Minister and the only senior advisor to survive at the top of government through Blair's decade in power. Yeah, one way to look at this, William, is that it's an influx of new Labour into the government. But also, you could say you can't exactly blame Keir Starmer. He's looking to a time when Labour was vaguely competent in power, so it makes sense to bring these people back. But it struck me that having Jonathan Powell as National Security Advisor was an interesting step, given that they already had a general earmarked for this, and going from a military advisor on national security to a very political advisor is quite a big step.
It is a big step. It depends how you view national security, doesn't it? Because it's not just the military side of things. You could argue it now covers a whole range of issues, and amongst them would be the international implications of the Trump presidency, which might hit security of one sort or another in several different ways. And maybe he feels that. A political advisor who is more familiar with the territory is more appropriate. It has given some fuel for the Tories to protest, saying you've got rid of a perfectly good general. But I think Powell has proved himself to be a highly competent figure, and that is something that I think the current Labour Party very, very much needs. From just going back very quickly to Ukraine, it's interesting that his specialisation, and particularly something he's written about, is rather getting negotiating with enemies. And what does that mean for what the Labour government's view of the Ukraine situation will be, particularly when Donald Trump weighs in with whatever he does? So an interesting appointment, and yes, we shall see how it pans out. I did do a double take at the name of Liz Lloyd, by the way, but you're absolutely right. It's not the Liz Lloyd with whom we are familiar, but a former Liz Lloyd. Obviously, a very common name in the circles of people who are doing machinations close to leaders.
I think you calling her a former Liz Lloyd is worse than me calling you a fixture. But there we are. To Scotland now, and North Sea operator Apache has said it will cease operations in the UK by the end of 2029, blaming the impact of the UK government's windfall tax. The American firm, now known as APA Corporation, said confirmation of changes to the Energy Profits Levy, EPL, in the recent budget meant it could not continue to invest in its North Sea assets. The company determined the expected returns do not economically support making investments required under the combined impact of the regulations, and it will cease production at its facilities in the North Sea prior to 2030, Apache said. Apache Chief Executive John Chrisman said that this was well ahead of what would have been an otherwise reasonable timeframe. Commenting, SNP economy spokesman Dave Duguid MP said, "The Labour Party have put our skilled offshore workforce at risk and are actively draining investment, risking our energy security and our ability to hit net zero. It's potentially the worst of all worlds." The simple truth is that you cannot meet net zero, and you certainly cannot create green growth if your plans hack away at both investment and the domestic workforce you need to deliver the energy transition. Let's not forget, more than 400 billion has flowed from our waters to the Treasury over the years, with little coming back the other way. Just as we saw with Grangemouth, when Labour's warm words meet fiscal reality, the consequences are grave. This week, Scottish Labour MPs skipped through the voting lobbies to threaten Scottish jobs and endanger Scotland's net zero future. That's something SNP MPs will never do, as we continue to put Scotland's interests first at every turn. I suppose, again, you can look at this in a number of ways, William, that climate protesters will be happy that this is potentially the end of some extraction from the North Sea. The SNP has certainly got plenty of political capital out of it that's costing Scottish jobs. And you could also take the view that if this field is still financially viable, somebody will simply buy it over the next 5 years from Apache. What's your take on it?
Well, it's complicated, and I think I'd just like to hear a wee bit more about how the just transition is actually going to take place, because this could be viewed as an opportunity, actually, to invest in that just transition. We've got like 5 years warning of the job losses potentially. They won't all happen at once, of course, but we need to start creating the new jobs now. And I think that's quite important, and we need to work out how we're going to do it, and the UK government needs to support it. So that would be the first thing I would say. The second thing is, this might be one of the occasions when we're beginning to see what the actual results of the Labour budget will be. They had no particular need to increase the windfall tax, which they did. The levy was raised to 38%, or indeed to extend it by a year. And that seems to have been, according to Apache anyway, the straw that broke the camel's back. And there might be other ways of looking at the tax situation, and certainly the Aberdeen and Grampian Chamber of Commerce are talking about, well, why can't we have something that is on a sliding scale according to whether the price of oil and gas is high or low? And that may be a more nuanced way of looking at it that might also bridge the gap. So I think the real need in this sort of transitional time for joined up thinking and maybe expecting the sort of thing, but also preparing for it. And I've yet to see the evidence that that's happening. And that makes it quite a nervous time for a lot of people in the oil industry in Aberdeen. But let's hope that that joined up thinking now follows, now that we're beginning to see what the actual fallout is.
Yeah, I'm staying with energy in Scotland. Now, sadly, my script has disappeared on this item, but I'm going to ad lib because it's something that I would very much like to ask you about. New figures published in the Financial Times show that the UK has the highest electricity prices for industrial users in the world. Indeed, the second highest, those in Germany, are only half of those in Scotland. The SNP issued a statement saying that they had long called for fairness in energy pricing in Scotland, and Dave Dugan, the energy spokesman, said that this was costing Scottish jobs, it was affecting investment in the renewables industry, and he ended the statement by saying that we have the energy, we have the skills, all we need is the power. What struck me most about this statement was the SNP has called for fairness. That is a very tame statement, it seems to me. Okay, Dave Dugan said we need the power, but surely that's what this needs to be about. We need the power to make decisions over our own energy resources and electricity.
Well, we absolutely do, and that would change everything. Um, Fairness is one way of looking at it, but what we're dealing with here is a completely outdated energy market, and it affects Scotland particularly badly. And one just thinks back again to what Greg Jackson, the CEO of Octopus, said just in the summer that with the resources we have and with what they contribute to our production, we could have in Scotland Europe's cheapest power, but instead we've got the most expensive. It's 25.46 pence per kilowatt hour in 2023 for UK industrial users. In Germany, it's 15.64. In Italy, it's 18.33. It's had 124% growth in 5 years. And the reason for that is we're far too reliant on gas-powered plants in terms of the UK. The marginal price is based on gas, much more so than in the EU. And electricity is particularly badly hit because it's subject to carbon taxes. So Scotland's actual consumption of energy, 2% from renewables and 26% from nuclear. So if you count nuclear as low carbon, that's 88% low carbon sources. And the prices that are being paid are for nothing of the sort. So it's the market that needs reform, and it needs it yesterday. And Ed Miliband, a familiar name, seems to be sitting on this idea and just papering the cracks. We need to look at this because it's putting the UK's industrial users and Scotland's industrial users at a severe disadvantage with its international rivals. Simple as that.
Yeah, and I mean, also in Scotland, the figure was for industrial users, but I think everyone who lives in Scotland knows the problems of costs as a domestic user also, and also for the suppliers in Scotland, they pay more to connect to the national grid
Yep.
than any other part of the country.
Absolutely. Yep. It needs to change. And yes, I think we could do a million times better under an independence scenario, but we aren't there yet, and we need to fight every step of the way to try and get things in a more sensible framework. And it could be done if there were the political will. And I think it would actually revolutionise much of the UK economy if we did that. And it would certainly be as good for households as it would be for businesses. So now there's the big challenge for the incoming Labour government. Can it rise to that challenge? It hasn't risen to very many so far, but you never know, it might change at some stage.
It might. I mean, you also say there that these problems would be solved by independence, giving us the power. And okay, I don't know what the SNP line is going to be for the next Scottish election, but it seems that energy, the unfairness of energy, and the bonus it could bring to Scotland should surely be the number one attack line for the SNP in campaigning for that, in the way Scotland's oil was back in the 70s.
I should think so. There are a lot of people on the pro-independence side really looking at energy in a big way now. It was to have been one of the big topics that the Independence Forum was going to be talking about at its convention, which isn't currently going to be happening on November 30th, but will be early in the new year. And there's talk about forming a group of looking at energy in the same way as the Scottish Currency Group looks at currency. So you would hope that it would be one of the big topics. And we're not going to get away with mild weather for much longer this winter, and certainly we can't guarantee it into next year. So it will be on people's minds, and it should be an absolute gold standard attack line and something that we can rely on. And independence may not solve it, but it gives us the tools to solve it. Then it's up to us. Right now, we're just having things done to us, and that's never acceptable. And eventually, it just knocks you down flat. We've got to get out of that.
Quite. Thank you. Shares in UK retailers have fallen after Labour's budget changes to national insurance contributions and tax thresholds. ASDA has warned that measures in the government's budget will be, quote, big burden for the supermarket chain, costing it £100 million and could prevent it from raising wages or hiring as many staff as it struggles to turn around falling sales. The company's warning on Friday came as other UK retailers' share prices took a hit as stock market investors continued to digest the implications of the changes to employers' national insurance contributions, NICs, announced in the Labour Chancellor Rachel Reeves' first budget. Marks and Spencer down 4.5%, JD Sports down 2.7%, and Tesco down 2.5% were among the fallers on the FTSE 100, pulling it down to a 3-month low. On the FTSE 250 index of smaller companies, the share prices of the bakery chain Greggs minus 6.8% and the pub group Mitchells and Butler falling 6.7% were also noted. Stuart Rose, the former boss of Marks and Spencer and Topshop, who was running ASDA, said the increase in employers' NICs and changes to tax thresholds would have consequences and meant it could not rule out some price increases. If you get presented with a bill unexpectedly for around £100 million, even if you're a business as big as us, that takes some digestion. So we're looking at the consequences of that, but you cannot rule out the fact that there will be some inflation, Lord Rose told The Guardian. Rose added that the changes in last week's budget meant that ASDA would have to look hard at every piece of expenditure, including the annual pay increase for staff, and may limit how many workers it hires. We've seen an increase in national minimum wage, he added. We want to attract good staff, but we have to look very, very hard to affordability. The measures in last week's budget come as ASDA is struggling to turn around falling sales and loss of grocery market share. Total revenues, excluding fuel, slid by 2.5% to £5.3 billion in the 3 months to the end of September, while like-for-like sales were 4.8% lower than the same quarter in 2023. However, this was a slight improvement on the previous quarter, when sales dipped by 6.4% between April and June. Well, what do you think, William? Should we shed a tear for the giant supermarket chains?
Well, I'm never one to shed tears for giant business, but this is another example of how budgets pan out. You never know really where the problems are going to arise. You can maybe predict until they actually start to arise, and we may be seeing that here. The question is, was it sensible for Labour to avoid raising taxes on working people, which could have been done in a progressive way that wouldn't have necessarily hit the poorest, when they may hit the poorest indirectly by a number of things, particularly if this turns out to be inflationary? Because businesses would argue that they've only got limited options once they've got a really fairly significant change to something like the national insurance arrangements that they have to pay. They can raise prices, which I'm sure this is the one they're threatening right now, and that's going to hit people. They could swallow lower profits. That might not be quite so desirable. They can become more efficient, whatever that may mean. It may mean that your checkout folks are going to disappear in even greater numbers than we've been seeing. I feel I should be invoicing them for all the time I do my own checkouts these days. They could raise wages by less than otherwise, and that isn't going to benefit working people at all. Or they could not just not take on staff, they could cut staff. Hey, even more checkouts that they're not operating in and we are. None of this necessarily helps working people, whatever that term may mean, the very group that Labour wanted to protect. So it's the law of unintended but perfectly foreseeable consequences, perhaps.
Indeed, as it is with every budget and tax change. Turning now to farmers, and angry farmers are threatening to drive their tractors along the stately streets of Westminster. They say they have had enough after the changes to inheritance tax in the government's budget last week, the latest of a long series of blows to farming. Rachel Reeves stirred up anger with her surprise announcement at the budget that farmland worth more than £1 million would be subject to inheritance tax. Since 1992, Agricultural Property Relief (APR) has meant family farms have been passed down tax-free in a policy intended to bolster food security and keep people working on family farms. This is just the latest policy to affect agriculture over the last few years. For decades, there had been anger over painful deals with supermarkets, which farmers said forced them to cut margins to the bone. Then came Brexit, which brought broken promises over trade deals with Australia and New Zealand, allowing cheap meat produced to lower standards into the UK and incensing farmers who felt undercut. It also meant a transition away from the subsidies of the EU's Common Agricultural Policy to a scheme in which farmers are paid for environmental goods, the delivery of which was botched and delayed. Farmers have also faced new export challenges and wrestled with access to much-needed seasonal workers. Farmers have also felt abandoned when extreme weather conditions caused by climate breakdowns have wiped out entire crops, while inflation has made input costs such as fuel and fertiliser rocket. The National Farmers Union NFU President Tom Bradshaw said, "After enduring years of being squeezed to the lowest margins imaginable, farmers are grappling with sky-high production costs for fuel, feed and fertiliser. Coupled with significant post-Brexit policy shifts and increasingly extreme weather conditions, there is nothing left for our nation's food producers to give." I should probably mention with regard to that story that the issue on inheritance tax stated by farmers is that if a farmer dies passing on the farm to his sons and daughters, that the farm may well be worth £1 million on paper, but there are no liquid assets to pay any inheritance tax, and it means that parts of the farm will have to be sold off, perhaps as development land, thus reducing agricultural land in production for years to come. So you're in the heart of big farming country there, William, in Perth. What are you hearing from farmers? What are people saying in the hub about this?
I might be speaking to one tomorrow. I haven't spoken to any yet. Not since the farmers said they would march in Westminster. A number of things. There's some dispute, I think, about just how many farms this inheritance tax thing is likely to affect. The Treasury says 28%, which is actually a fairly large number, I would have thought, but never mind. Whereas DEFRA has figures that would suggest it's more likely to be 2/3, which really would be an issue. Second thing to say is that food security in an increasingly uncertain world is very, very important, and any government needs to be very careful about anything that might threaten it. And you could make the case that that's exactly what's happening here. And that would certainly worry me, particularly post-Brexit, where necessarily getting the trade deals that would get the food in that we can't produce for ourselves might prove to be harder. And the third sort of thing to note here, I think, also is a lot of this problem is because of the high price of land. And part of that has been down to a fair bit of speculation, possibly based on the kind of arrangements for inheritance tax for farm properties that have been in force since 1992. And some farmers are saying, look, we're being sort of held responsible for what's effectively a tax loophole being exploited by a few mega rich people. And they're suggesting that they might want to look differently about how the tax treatment of capital gains by non-farming individuals buying farming property is treated. So it's a complicated thing. And I suspect, I don't think UK farmers quite have the same clout as French farmers, but if they discover just a little bit of that, the government might just have to rethink how it looks at this and maybe look to see if it can't raise the funds in another way, or at least put in safeguards that keep food security at the level it is at the very least, and hopefully enhance it. So another challenge. They've got lots of thinking to do. Maybe it'll be one of Jonathan Powell's national security things. Who knows?
Indeed, thank you. And we don't have time to explore it tonight. Perhaps we'll come back to it on one of the Sunday programs. That the supermarkets who are complaining about not having enough money have had a huge role to play in the situation that farmers face nowadays.
Yep,
Medicine now. Everything's connected, yes, indeed. Doctors are hailing a groundbreaking new treatment for lupus that genetically modifies a patient's cells to fight the autoimmune disease and could end the need for lifelong medication. Lupus can range from mild to severe, with symptoms including joint pain, skin problems, fatigue, and inflammation of major organs. Patients often have to take drugs their whole lives, ranging from ibuprofen to steroid tablets and injections, or other immunosuppressant or biological medicines. About 5 million people worldwide are thought to have the condition, which mostly affects women. In the UK, 3 patients have received CAR T-cell therapy for the most serious form of lupus, which can be life-threatening and cause damage to the heart, lungs, brain, and kidneys. In Germany, patients who have had the new treatment are now in remission and do not need to take lupus drugs. Professor Ben Parker, a consultant rheumatologist at Manchester Royal Infirmary, said he believed the breakthrough could revolutionise treatment for lupus patients and might lead to a cure for the disease. Lupus is a disease that requires lifelong medication, but this therapy has the potential to change that, which is incredibly exciting. This groundbreaking new therapy marks a significant milestone in our research into lupus. Until now, CAR T-cell therapy has mostly been used in cancer patients, but researchers believe it could treat a range of other diseases. It works by genetically modifying cells to enable the body's own immune system to recognize and attack problem cells, offering people a possible cure. Patients having the new treatment will be followed up for 15 years to fully assess its effects. Doctors hope CAR T-cell therapy could correct the underlying defect in lupus and potentially cure those with the most serious form of the disease. People undergoing the new treatment require a 10-day hospital stay and are warned of possible side effects. This includes their immune system being very susceptible to infection for several weeks, or another condition that causes the immune system to go into overdrive. However, many patients whose lupus is getting worse and who may be entering kidney failure, for example, may decide the risks are worth it. Dr. Eleni Tahuli, the director of the Adult Stem Cell Transplant Unit at Manchester Royal Infirmary, said, "It's an incredibly exciting time to now offer this mode of treatment to lupus patients through this clinical trial. We hope it will provide positive outcomes and revolutionise treatment options for patients with the disease." Well, an easier to understand health story than the last one we dealt with together on this program about selenium. So this is good news. Fortunately, I've not had problems within my own family, but I know several people who suffer from lupus.
Right. Well, it does sound like very good news, although it's still early days, and I can see why they're going to want to be continuing to monitor patients for was it 15 years? I think you said. Um,
Yeah,
with all of these things, it's risks versus benefit, and uh, the 10-day hospital stay will enable them to monitor at least the acute side effects, and hopefully, we've got to the point where we're getting quite good at genetic modification, and that we managed to stave off the other things. But early days, but fingers crossed this will actually make a difference. And it does really, I think, positively affect people not to be on medication for things, because medication in itself is a bunch of side effects. So you trade one set of side effects for another, and hopefully this will be the way forward, as it will be in so many other cases. And it's interesting too that it's a crossover from cancer treatment. So again, we're beginning to see again how everything can be connected, and how something that affects one condition positively might also affect another.
Yeah, and at the very least, it's nice to have a positive story on the news. Back to energy, and the chief executive of COP29 has been filmed apparently agreeing to facilitate fossil fuel deals at the climate summit. The recording has amplified calls by campaigners who want the fossil fuel industry and its lobbyists to be banned from future COP talks. The campaign group Global Witness posed undercover as a fake oil and gas group, asking for deals to be facilitated in exchange for sponsoring the event. In the calls, Elnur Sultanov, Azerbaijan's Deputy Energy Minister and Chief Executive of COP29, agreed to this and spoke of a future that includes fossil fuels, perhaps forever. COP officials also introduced the fake investor to a senior executive at the national oil and gas company, SOCAR, to discuss investment opportunities. Sultanov told the fake investment group, "I would be happy to create a contact between your team and their team so that they can start discussions." Shortly after that, they received an email from SOCAR. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UN body that oversees COP, says officials should not use their roles to seek private gain, and it expects them to act, quote, without self-interest. On the recording, Sultanov tells the fake oil and gas group, "There are a lot of joint ventures that could be established. SOCAR is trading oil and gas all over the world, including in Asia." He then described natural gas as a transitional fuel, adding, "We'll have a certain amount of oil and natural gas being produced, perhaps forever." At COP28, the countries involved agreed to transition away from fossil fuels, and the UN body, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is clear that developing new oil and gas fields is incompatible with climate goals signed up to in the Paris Agreement. The COP29 team also appeared willing to waive climate requirements for the company if it sponsored the event. COP event sponsors are supposed to commit to cutting their emissions and are expected to sign a national pledge promising to come up with a credible net zero transition plan at some point over the next 2 years. However, during the negotiations, these requirements were waived and a new clause was added to give the fake investment group meeting opportunities with key local stakeholders from the energy sector at COP29. A spokesperson for Global Witness said the UNFCCC urgently needs to act to clean up the COP climate talks, starting by banning the fossil fuel industry from sponsoring them and kicking their lobbyists out for good. Well, a fairly shocking story, perhaps will surprise few, but equally the call to kick fossil fuel lobbyists out and not talk to them is a bit unrealistic. I mean, they are part of the problem. They also have to be part of the solution. So how do you strike a balance in something like this?
Well, it's difficult because if you give them an inch, they seem to want to take a mile. And when you're bending the already agreed ways of dealing with those exchanges to try to accommodate them, whether or not it's for personal gain, it may not be. It doesn't really matter because you are bending the rules, and the rules are there for a reason. If you're going to be dealing with fossil fuels companies, they need to fulfill their part of the bargain and not just get a free ride. It's a natural thing for them to want to capture the whole process, and that's what the rules are for, to prevent that from happening. I believe there was a similar scandal at not perhaps exactly the same thing, and it certainly wasn't exposed in the same way at COP28, but there were some leaked documents about the UAE was dealing with some fossil fuel companies. So I wouldn't necessarily ban them, but I would be a lot firmer about the rules and regulations for dealing with them and what they have to sign up to in order to take part in the talks. I know Global Witness would like them off the scene entirely, and no doubt others would as well. But you're right. I think to exclude them probably does more harm than good. So it's just a case of getting the framework right.
Thank you. And staying with energy on a smaller scale, the Scottish Government has announced that wood-burning stoves, bioenergy and peat heating will now be permitted in new homes and buildings following a review of the new build heat standard commissioned by ministers earlier this year. An amendment to regulations made today permits the installation of bioenergy and peat main heating systems and any type of secondary heating systems in new buildings from the 1st of January 2025, while maintaining the prohibition on mains gas and oil boilers as a mains heating system. Alistair Allen, Acting Minister for Climate Action, said, "The new build heat standard is crucial to help reduce emissions from new buildings, preventing the need for retrofit in the future and ensuring a cleaner and greener Scotland. Heat from our homes and buildings makes up almost a fifth of Scotland's carbon emissions, so we must tackle the most polluting forms of domestic heating to reach net zero. We have listened to concerns from rural and island communities about resilience in times of bad weather or power outages, as well as the wider use of bioenergy and peat for other reasons. These changes address these concerns whilst retaining the spirit of the original legislation, which aims to eradicate polluting gas and oil boilers from new homes and buildings." I would like to thank all of those who submitted evidence and views, particularly those from rural and island communities. Their input has been vital in delivering this positive outcome. Well, I lived much of my early life in a small Perthshire village which had no mains gas and oil heating, which required electricity for a pump to feed the oil. So when there was a power cut, there was nothing except a coal fire or a wood fire. Now, obviously, these modern wood stoves are considerably more efficient and less polluting than the old coal fire. So this sounds like a sensible decision, is it, to go back on the original legislation?
Yeah, I think it possibly is. I mean, that's what consultations are for. The Tories seem to be labelling this some sort of humiliating climb down, but Kate Forbes has been talking about how this will affect rural communities for quite some time, and it's perfectly sensible to consult with those who are likely to be affected by your proposed legislation to see if you need to tweak it in any way. And health groups are not happy about it, but I think that is to some extent alleviated by the fact that, as you say, modern wood burners are considerably less polluting and less likely, for example, to give you asthma. So as long as the spirit of the legislation is maintained and it's not a coach and horses for lots of new properties which very much aren't in the rural locations, to also suddenly include wood burning stoves, then I think it is perfectly sensible and just the way that the government should be operating. So I don't have a problem with it at all.
Good, thank you. Final story tonight. Brian Cox has said that artists need to, he says, keep the flag of truth flying following Donald Trump's election victory. Cox, who played Logan Roy in the hit HBO series Succession, also said the world has, quote, never been in a more dangerous place than it is at the moment, as he reflected on the US election campaign and a second impending Trump presidency. As artists, we have to bang the drum. We have to keep going, he said in an interview with The Guardian. We mustn't put up with it. That's why I admire people like Mark Ruffalo, a longtime advocate for social justice. I'm not going to give up on my criticism of Trump. I think it behoves artists to not give up, to keep the flag of truth flying because it's been so abused in recent years. Cox went viral on Tuesday night after making his disdain for Trump known during a virtual appearance on Channel 4. Brian Cox said he was, quote, acutely depressed about the election and felt like he just had to ride it out. It's extraordinary that Trump has so many Catholic voters. I'm not religious at all, but I was born a Catholic, so I know about the Catholic doctrine, and Trump's sins are unbelievable. How can they possibly rationalize their faith in relationship to him? I look at the US and I think it's a fucking mess, Cox continued. I don't know who or where it is. It doesn't know who or where it is. Trump's vitriol towards Harris during the campaign was unbelievable. Cox also spoke about other crises he believed Americans would be facing, including reproductive rights and the climate crisis. Women are being treated as second-class citizens in America, and it has to stop. It's gone on for far too long, he said. Nobody should be discussing what a woman should do with her body, only they should advocate for what happens to their body. How dare we make that assumption? It's so retrograde. He added, I can't believe I'm living in the 21st century because we don't seem to progress as human beings. We seem to make the same mistake time and time again. Well, strong words from Brian Cox, and I'm sure many would agree with the sentiment behind them. Do artists make a difference? Can artists make a difference?
I think they have to make a difference. I think if artists can't speak up in their own way, if writers and performers can't take a stand and show the world itself, if you like, as it actually is, and point to where the problems are, then who can? So yeah, I'm fully behind it. I would go beyond Donald Trump. Donald Trump is going to be a severe shock to the world system, and there are going to be some bad effects from it. His presidency, no doubt. There might be some interestingly not so bad effects. We don't know for sure, but the evidence suggests and the experience suggests that there are going to be some tricky moments, and that's when people need to stand up and be counted, and artists have got to be among those people. It can be a dangerous thing in a world where opinions not that of the rulers are not tolerated to nearly the same extent. And so there's that part of it. So you've got to have courage as well. And I think Brian Cox is absolutely right. I would just say that, yeah, it's not just Trump you have to worry about. It's so much that's on in the world, and so much cruelty and horror and corruption and nastiness. In a sense, creatively, it's a great time to be an artist or a writer or something like that, even if it is dangerous times. So I would encourage them, and I'm fully behind Brian Cox.
Okay, thank you. And that wraps it up for tonight. Before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. We set our current fundraising target in April, hoping to reach 36,000 by the end of the year. It's November and we have raised 16,500. However, to pay our bills and survive, we need to raise £12,000 now to get us back on target. We face costs of over £4,000 every month, but only receive donations of around 2,500. We need more regular subscribers, but we need to clear our debts as well. We are at crisis point and really need to increase our donations to be able to pay our bills and survive. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. And please, donate whatever you can afford. Thank you very much to my guest tonight, William Duguid, and thank you to you for watching wherever you are, now or on catch-up. And please join us again on Broadcasting Scotland for the Full Scottish on Sunday. But for me, I wish you a good night. Bye-bye.